Hello, welcome to our webinar, Global Security and Law Enforcement Trends in an Age of Turmoil. I'm really excited to be here. My name is D.J. Murphy. I'm the Editor-in-Chief of ISC News. I consider today's presentation a very special one for us for a number of reasons. Number one, this is the first ISC News webinar that will be broadcast not only in the US, but translated into Spanish and Portuguese for the ISC community in Mexico and Brazil. We're really excited about that. I want to welcome viewers who are tuning in from those countries. We're really pleased to be able to make this an international event, a time when we can get the perspective of someone for the way these matters affect different countries as going forward. So the second reason that I'm excited is our guest, who I will introduce in just a moment. And the third reason, most important reason that I'm excited about today is the topic of today's discussion. I think when they are writing the history of the early 21st century, the first half of 2020 is going to stand out. It really is. January brought the first truly global viral pandemic in decades. It's had a tremendous impact worldwide. More than 500,000 people have died from COVID-19 since, and it has affected the whole world. Then in May, a black man was killed by a police officer in Minneapolis, Minnesota. It has touched off fierce protests that continued into the summer, and that call into question the nature of policing itself, and really is going to force a lot of reflection from the law enforcement community and from folks who are engaged in protest, and there are issues that need to be examined, and we're happy to be able to do that today. Both events have had and will continue to have really profound effects on law enforcement, on first responders, on public safety itself, and on the security industry too. And I can't think of anyone more qualified to come in and discuss it with us from the perspective of law enforcement than our guest. James Gagliano is a 25-year veteran of the FBI. He spent much of his time in New York City, but he did spend significant time in Mexico, so he brings that international perspective to this that we're going to touch on a little bit later. He has retired from the FBI and since then has become a doctoral candidate. He's getting his doctorate in police uses of force at St. John's University in New York. So the perspective from an educational standpoint that he brings to this, as well as on the street experience as well, is fantastic. He's also a frequent contributor on CNN, and we are just really pleased to have him. Jimmy, thank you so much for joining us today. So happy you could be here with us.
DJ, thanks for having me. I know you and I had originally discussed doing something like this in regards to emergent technologies and how police and law enforcement writ large and the security industry were going to work together to deal with 21st century emergent threats. And obviously, as you pointed out, the last 3 months has just completely remade policing and how we think about it, as well as the security industry. So I'm excited to be here. Nobody better than you to ask the tough questions, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
I appreciate it. Me too. Absolutely. So we will touch on all three of those issues, including COVID and including the nature of collaboration and how law enforcement works with the security industry. But the sort of current situation that was touched off by George Floyd's death in Minneapolis is front and center right now. So that's really what I think we should go over first. And to set the stage, I kind of want to get your take overall on that specific situation, because that is what touched off this latest round of protests that seems to have more momentum than protests have in the past. So I know you've gone on the record on TV and on social media with a take on that. So just tell me how you felt about the initial incident. We'll move forward from there about what it touched off.
Sure. So from the perspective of, as you pointed out at the top, a practitioner, which I kind of did things backwards. I was a practitioner for 25 years in law enforcement, and then I moved into the academic realm. And so I try to approach this from the perspective of what makes sense and what do the numbers say? What are the facts and the statistics? And how do we look at this from a quantitative and qualitative research analysis perspective? The other part of it is anecdotal. And my perspective as a Caucasian cop, somebody who spent 25 years, much of that time, as you pointed out, working in the inner city, my perspective versus somebody else who's different than me, that grew up with a different skin tone or from a different racial or ethnic genealogical or ancestral trail than I have. So I try to balance these things. And look, you and I talked about this recently in preparation for this, and we know that we acknowledge that we're blessed that we live in a country with amazing freedoms, and we're part of the West, which includes Latin America, that is at the leading edge of a lot of things, a lot of different type of good revolutions, industrial revolutions, technological revolutions, human rights revolutions. But we also have to acknowledge that we do have a painful past. And, the first slaves, the first African slaves were brought to this country in 1619, okay? Our country's been a country for 244 years, but for 400 plus years, we did partake in human bondage, all right? The slavery industry. And yes, and this is an uncomfortable thing to state, because as you know, I'm a fierce proponent of law enforcement. I defend them when they're right. I serve on the board of directors for the Law Enforcement Legal Defense Fund, which defends and helps pay legal defenses for wrongfully accused police officers. But we got to be straight, and we got to talk about things in context. And yes, this country started its policing units, if you will, as slave patrols back in the 17th century. That's not where we're at today. And the 700,000 to 800,000 men and women who strap on, a sidearm and pin a badge onto their uniform every day and go to work to protect us in a country of 327 million people, less than 18,000 agencies, law enforcement across the country. The vast majority of those folks are good folks, full stop. But let's also acknowledge that there are anomalies, and we can argue what that percentage is, whether it's infinitesimal, as I would argue, or whether it's more prevalent that some of us are comfortable acknowledging. So having said that, I want to point out a couple of quick statistics, which I think put things into perspective. Police officers in this country, in the United States, have 250 million, with an M, million interactions with private citizens every year. 250 million. There are about 1,000 fatal police shootings every year, 1,000. The vast majority of those deal with an armed subject, a non-compliant violent felon who decides, I'm not going to be arrested today, and I'm going to kill you unless you kill me first. There are a handful, and DJ, I know handful is the operative term here, 5 to 10, less than two, the numbers on two hands, that are questionable every year of someone considered unarmed that is shot. Having said that, the George Floyd situation in Minneapolis, what occurred on Memorial Day, you and I discussed this a couple weeks ago. It chilled me to my bone. It was outrageous, and what it did was set back police and communities, inner city communities, communities of color, predominantly of color, of black and brown people. It set back relations decades. What took place there, which was an officer that had a handcuffed man proned out on the ground in his control, restrained, and then elected to put a knee into the man's neck for some 9+ minutes. Now, we can argue the officer involved in this has been charged with second-degree murder, which I believe was appropriate. The 3 other officers who were there and complicit because they didn't say, get off of his neck, he's been arrested, have been charged with aiding and abetting. And look, let's wait for that to work its way through our criminal justice system. I have great faith in our system. I know there are outliers or cases that are, that don't go the way that they should, but I'm going to trust that and let that run its course. The second incident that you and I have spoken about was the incident that involved Rayshard Brooks in Atlanta. And if you want to touch on just the difference there, that was a case where a man fell asleep in the drive-thru at Wendy's, and police officers were called. He was clearly intoxicated. They performed a number of field sobriety tests. The man decided he didn't want to be arrested, got into a violent struggle with the police officers, stole one of their tasers, and then fired the taser while he was fleeing and was fatally shot. Different case, But I think, DJ, on the heels of what we just dealt with George Floyd, the metastasization, as you pointed out, of protests, most of them peaceful and legitimate and righteous, and some that have turned into riots and looting, which have taxed police departments and taxed politicians that have to make determinations on how we should police going forward. But I think they're two separate cases. But to your point, hugely impact things and raise the issue of where are we going to go now in policing?
Yeah, and I think it's important to acknowledge, at least from my perspective, that while maybe the case count is low, I think a lot of this protest is born out of the fact that the general public maybe sees these events happen and maybe sees officers charged, but thinks that in the end they're not accountable. They're let off. I mean, the high-profile cases where this happens tend to foment this kind of protest, and that's what we have here, kind of in a preemptive way, because I think a lot of folks not only are concerned about the actual event with George Floyd and then subsequently with Rayshard Brooks, but they are anticipating what's going to happen from an accountability standpoint, and maybe touch a little bit on that, and you know, if this seems different this time.
Yeah. So does this seem different? Yes, 100%. This has energized, this has turned out folks from all walks of life, from all different professions, from all different races, ethnicities, sexual orientations, folks across the country, not just across the country, but internationally. We're seeing some of these protests going on in Europe and Latin America, and people arguing that, hey, police are designed to protect and serve. We need to hold them accountable. Now, I'll caveat that by just saying this. Again, we deal with anecdotal evidence, and then we also deal with the academic pursuit, the research evidence. And there's a thing called, you know, availability heuristic, which says, hey, whatever you see in the media, whatever you're inundated with, that's what you think reality is. So the argument becomes, is it because the media treats these things differently than if George Floyd had been a white man? Would anybody have made this a national story or international story? The answer is no. But we also have to be fair, and we have to caveat it and say, but we have a history, and it is different. We need to acknowledge that. Now, going forward, and you teed me up with a question here, what is the right approach? Well, number one, hold the bad apples. And there are bad apples in the policing ranks. They're in every profession, journalism, they're in security, they're in professional sports, they're bad apples. But because we are armed instruments of the state and given license to take a life, right, in the pursuit of doing our duties, bringing someone to justice, we also have a supreme obligation to do it the right way. And when we do it the wrong way, to be held accountable. To your point, there have been historical examples. The Rodney King case in 1992, where the police officers were originally on the state level exonerated for the beating of Rodney King. There have been a number of cases like that. Look, we've got to find that sweet spot. And look, and we don't have time to do it today, but this is going forward. Do we need to talk about qualified immunity in the United States, which says if a police officer operating under the color of authority makes an arrest or does something, he is protected from civil and certain extent criminal liability because he is operating under the color of authority? Do we need to examine that? Yes. Do we need to examine police unions? Of course. We should also examine labor unions and teachers unions because they have a ton of power, collective bargaining wise, but also they protect their ranks. And because policing is a different industry, do we need to look at that? The answer is yes. Thirdly and lastly, defund the police, abolish the police. Unserious, silly, and dangerous, okay? Now, I know that people have different interpretations. Some people said, well, it's defund the police, but what we mean is just steer some funds towards social programs or steer some of their budget toward this. Let's have that conversation. The bottom line is, when a man is beating his wife or his partner at his house, and she desperately calls or he desperately calls for assistance, a social worker, a crisis intervention specialist, a sociologist cannot show up when somebody is is conducting violence against another human being. You have to send the police. Now, do we ask too much of our police officers in the United States and in the Western Hemisphere? We do. We expect them to be mental health professionals, social scientists, clinical therapists, mental health professionals. We expect them to be all of those things. And maybe it's too much. We need to look at it. We also need to professionalize the police. It is a shame in this country that is 244 years old, and as I pointed out, has had some form of policing here since 1619. It is a shame that there is no requirement for local police departments or state police departments to report out use of force. Here's what I argue: tie federal funding to it. If you do not report out your use of force, you don't get federal funds. That will make that happen quickly. Right now, and I know this from studying it, the only credible source we have available is the Washington Post. And that's not right, that a newspaper since 2015 has actually tracked police deadly force incidents. That's insane. The FBI started it a year ago in 2019. They finally took it on. They took on that responsibility, which I think was a great idea, but it requires them to scour the internet, scour local reporting, and hope that agencies are reporting it out, and they're not doing it. So I got to tell you, DJ, this is low-hanging fruit. This is something we need to do to be transparent and to make the citizens that we are sworn to protect and serve comfortable that we have nothing to hide.
Yeah, and I think that it speaks to the accountability issue that we talked about. And this isn't on a on an individual basis, but on a industry-wide basis. And it makes a lot of sense. Is there pushback towards that? I mean, why hasn't something like that happened already?
Well, there's a whole host of reasons. I would think some of it is because policing is a product of the states. We don't have a federal police force. And I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all template that you could say policing in Paducah, Kentucky is the same as policing in Brownsville, Brooklyn, okay? Policing in the Sinaloa region of Mexico City is the same as policing inside Mexico City proper. There are distinctions, but we do need to professionalize the force. And I think part of that is going to be having some type of federal standards. Are we going to allow chokeholds? Well, DJ, I'll tell you this. If I'm in an existential struggle for my life and somebody's going to kill me and I'm a law enforcement officer, I can do whatever I can to protect myself or any other innocent person. But should we be using them in restraint or when someone is in custody in those type of situations? That's a fair discussion to have. That is something I think the federal government could do at that level. But whether or not we're able to say, hey, it's a cookie cutter, one size fits all, that's going to be difficult because the state of Florida, the state of Texas don't want to police like the state of Illinois or the state of New York or the state of California. But like everything else, DJ, that you and I talk about, we got to find the balance and we got to find the sweet spot where we can professionalize the force, but not make it one size fits all.
Yeah, and that seems to be, I mean, finding that balance is the entire challenge, it seems to. I mean, when we talked about the protests originally, you talked about the righteousness of it, and there's no denying that. I mean, it was born out of a horrific situation. But then we also talked about Rayshard Brooks, and that is a muddy situation. It gets very complicated very quickly. And the protests are the same way. So kind of go over the challenge for law enforcement as you try to police a situation from a public safety standpoint where large crowds are, it turns ugly and you don't know when that's going to happen. But what kind of bind are they in right now when trying to find that balance and ride that edge between policing peaceful protests and controlling crowds and then dealing with violence?
Well, I think part of it is related to the human condition, which is if you look throughout history, we always tend to over course correct. So, as you pointed out, I spent time in Mexico. So if, PAN, P-A-N, if that political party is in power, the next time that PRI the opposite end of the political continuum party comes in, you see this wide swing. You know, we had in the United States, we had 8 years of President Obama. Now we have 4 years of Donald Trump. We don't know what's going to happen in 2020. But what the tendency is over course correction. It is the same thing in policing, the same thing in security. What happens? You look back in the United States in the 1990s. Look, in New York City, I was a brand new FBI agent the year 1990 that New York City saw the most homicides in its history, right? A city of 8.4 million people suffered 2,245 homicides. Last year, there had 300 and change. That's 300 and change too many. But the course correction is to get rid of all the policing methodological implementations like CompStat, the computer statistics of looking at a precinct commander's area of operation and determining where resources are going to go. Stop, question, and frisk. You know, the ability for a police officer to use reasonable suspicion to stop somebody on the street and say, I'm going to frisk you for a gun because my experience tells me you might have one on you, which was a deterrent effect. And then you look at broken windows, right? Wilson and Kelling back in the 1980s came up with this notion that says, if you clamp down on small quality of life crimes, you know, somebody who jumps a turnstile on the subway, he may have a gun on him. So if you stop him for that, you may inadvertently be able to prevent further, more violent crime. Look, those things were all successful in taking New York City from a violent city back in the 70s, 80s, early 90s into one of the safest cities in New York. But the law of unintended consequences, right? 1994, the United States comes up with the crime bill. President Bill Clinton is the president, signs into law. The Congressional Black Caucus supports it and demands it. Now we look at that and we demonize it and say, but what did that do? It caused mass incarceration. It destroyed families because it sent many black and brown men to jail on the failed war on drugs, if you will. So we have to look at that. Circling quickly back to your issue on the riots. Look, and we acknowledge, both of us, the vast majority of the exercise of First Amendment rights, people protesting can be ugly. It can be loud, noisy, obnoxious. Trust me, I lived through some of that in Mexico City when the teachers unions or political parties or human rights folks were protesting in front of the US Embassy. It's loud, it's uncomfortable, it's noisy. It cannot turn to violence. And in the United States, we've had police precincts burned. We've had police precincts in Washington State, in Seattle, occupied. We've had things called autonomous zones, which means citizens get together, these groups, and decide that nobody can come in. We're going to shut these 6 city blocks down. We exist here under the rule of law. Much of the Western world and Latin America exist under the rule of law. There has to be a sweet spot. Let people be heard. Let them be angry. Let them be upset. Let them air their grievances. They have a right to do that, to petition their government, but they have to do it the right way. And what we're seeing right now with statues being toppled, not just statues of Confederate soldiers, but statues of Abraham Lincoln, Teddy Roosevelt, the first president to actually host an African-American man at the White House. We're seeing Father Junipero Serra in California pulled down. This has gone too far. But we're also putting our police in the position of, right now, people are angry at them, and now we're asking them to go out there and police. How do you do it? It's difficult. We have these issues with less than lethal thing. You know, we have a thing called, you know, kinetic impact projectiles, right? Sounds kind of benign. They're rubber bullets, right? And unfortunately, those things, even though they're not supposed to be lethal and they're not supposed to grievously wound somebody, they can. The same way a taser can, the same way that gas can cause people with asthma or with underlying health conditions, cause them problems. This is a big issue for the US right now, especially in how to deal with this. Are the police overly militarized? We don't want that. But do we want our police officers to be beaten senseless or to have bricks thrown at their heads and not be able to defend themselves? And again, I guess it goes back, DJ, to the thing. We have to find that sweet spot. And that's what we're struggling to do right now.
Yeah, the pendulum that you talked about in policing is the same pendulum that's taking effect in the protests. You know, that the anger that they have has swung, you know, too far one way, too far another way, and it's very difficult to get it right. We've talked about this, you and I, about there's in the public square, there's not really a chance to exercise nuance very effectively. So that being said, what does the conversation have to look like? How does it have to go? Does the sort of institution of policing have the ability to reflect on itself, and how much pushback is there going to be? Who needs to get together to solve these issues?
So to answer your question in one word, as far as, does policing need to be reformed and does something need to happen? Yes, unequivocally, yes. We're at the tipping point right now. And what is the tipping point? We're at the tipping point where in Minneapolis, the city council voted to defund the police, to not give any money to the police. Now, we know that there have been places, I think Camden, New Jersey has been a place that's been put out there as an example of, hey, most violent city inside the state of New Jersey. They felt that the police were ineffective. They felt that the police were too brutalizing to the citizens. And what did the state do? They came in, they took it over, they disbanded it, they reconstituted. Now, people think that they just did away with it, and that's not the case. I mean, in polite society and for a democracy to work, and much of the Western world, Latin America, the United States, much of the Western world are democracies or representative republics. And for that to work, you have to have people that are willing to put their lives on the line, as law enforcement does, and people in the security industry, and make sure that the rule of law is enforced. How do you do that without alienating the people that you are sworn to protect and serve? DJ, I think to sum it up, you've got to bring everybody to the table. Look, there's businesses that are marketing defund the police pizza and defund the police beer. They're trying to take Puppy Patrol off of the children's cartoon off the air. The TV show Cops and Live PD have been removed. The pendulum again has swung too far to that side. We've got to have sober voices on both sides, right? When I say both sides, the people that have legitimate grievances about how we police in this country and in the West, and on the other side, that are putting their lives on the line to keep us all safe, getting paid a pittance. And maybe that's the argument too. You want to professionalize the police? Make sure that a 6-month police academy where, it's almost shake and bake, you do your best you can to get them in there as quick as possible, because you've got to send them out there to fill the gaps, because people are retiring, resigning, they're leaving in droves right now. So maybe we lengthen the time of the training. We make sure that we include things like de-escalation training and community interaction, and we bring members of the community, faith leaders in to have that conversation. Right now, we're just talking at each other. We've got to come to the table. We've got to come up with sober solutions that everybody can get around, and Congress has got to get off their you-know-what, and they've got to make this happen. I know that there was a bill the Republicans just tried to push through that got tabled. I know the Democrats have a bill here, but in every country that we're speaking to right now, there are competing sides that have political interest. We've got to get them together, and then we've got to get police forces and community leaders together to come up with a solution.
And hopefully that's what comes out of this. This is as turbulent a time as I can remember in this regard. But I don't know that that progress has been possible in this country without protest. We were born out of protest, and so when it gets the worst, hopefully that's when those voices do come together and they are able to hammer things out, because there is pressure that unlike they've seen before. So that hopefully is the way we're going to go. Now, underlying this, at the same time that this is happening, and before this happened, and what a time for two global events to happen like this. But we have a pandemic going on. The coronavirus, it started slow here, and it built very quickly and became a major problem in the U.S., now in Brazil. Around the world, they're having very difficult times controlling this, and the medical community is doing the best that they can. But it has real impact on the law enforcement community, the first responder community, and public safety. So let's shift gears and talk about the pandemic and talk about how this particular event has changed the nature of law enforcement. So just give me a little bit of kind of your top line on the big changes, and then we'll get into some questions after that.
Sure. So, I mean, talking about it from the perspective of, who does a pandemic, by definition impact? I mean, pandemic is an epidemic writ large, right? So in the United States, as you pointed out before, we're lucky. We have good sanitation. We have good health and hygiene. The last time we had something on this level, and I'm not a doctor, but was 100 years ago, right? The Spanish flu in 1918. So we're looking at 100 plus years. And I'm gonna take some ownership of this because I served as the crisis management coordinator for the FBI during the mid-aughts, right? 2005 till about 2008. And I remember writing things, we called it the crisis response plan, the continuity of operations plan. What would we do in the FBI? God forbid there was another 9/11 and our building was taken out, or we had to move people because of bird flu or Ebola. And I have to tell you this, DJ, and I'm gonna give you a sober, issue of responsibility here. I looked at pandemics as abstractions. That wasn't something I was worried about. I was worried about Al Qaeda. I was worried about white supremacists or terrorist groups, like Al Shabaab and Al Qaeda. I wasn't worried about the bird flu because it was an abstraction. It isn't an abstraction anymore, and it impacts everybody because whether we take it somewhere else or somebody else brings it here, discounting where it began. I mean, at this juncture, it doesn't matter where the origin was. The bottom line is every part of the world, with the exception of a few places frozen at the top and bottom of the globe, has cases of this. How does it impact law enforcement? Well, it impacts it in a lot of ways. First of all, these are first responders, right? I'm an academic. I put that in quotation marks, by the way, loosely applied. I can work from home. A cop can't. A medical worker at a hospital can't. They're on the front line. So our frontline folks, they are going to be the most susceptible to the contagion, to getting the infection, to getting the virus, to contracting it while they're doing their job. They can wash their hands 1,000 times a day. They can wear a mask. That is still not a guarantee that because they come into contact with someone that has it, that they're going to be safe while they're doing their job. And for police, where a lot of their work sometimes requires use of force, meaning somebody goes, nope, you're not arresting me for that murder, I'm not going in, and the cop has to put their hands on them, you have now come in contact with somebody that could have hepatitis C or COVID-19. So this is a big issue. Now, you compound that, and we won't have time to get into all these things, but I'll enumerate them. You compound that with bail reform. A lot of states, New York, New Jersey are two that I'm very familiar with because I'm here in the Northeast. A lot of states have undergone bail reform, which says that unless it is the most violent of crimes, you do not have to post cash bail. So it's a revolving door of recidivists that would normally be stuck in a jail cell pending their day in court, but now are just basically given a desk appearance ticket and said, bye, come back on your court date and you're fine. Even though you've just done this 25 times in a row, we're going to let you out. That puts more bad people, when I say bad people, bad actors back out on the street. You then compound it with the fact, and I'll use New York again, not that it's the center of the world, but I'm going to use it again as an example, where because of the spike in COVID-19 in places with population densities like New York City, there's been an effort to release people from jail, okay? Release people from prisons early. That puts people back into the mix again. Not all of them are going to be recidivists. Not all of them are going to reoffend. Some of them will. That now taxes the police even more. You compound that with places that have population densities. New York City is 8.4 million people. Mexico City, I believe, is 19 million people. So even if you do everything right, because everybody's living in such a tightly confined place, it's not like Appalachia, where you can go miles without seeing a neighbor. How do these infections spread? How does the pandemic continue? Because people transmit it to other people, and that happens in big cities. That makes it tougher. So you add also the issue that we're asking cops to do things that are difficult and put them again into tight situations of a potential for escalation of violence with citizens. What do I mean? Enforcing social distancing. Right now, with everything on edge, send a couple of cops in uniform with a badge on and a gun and say, hey, there's a group of people playing stickball over there. There's a group of kids kicking a soccer ball. Go break them up. And if they don't agree to disperse, write tickets or arrest them. We ask our cops to do too much. You combine what's going on with the distrust in policing and the adversarial relationship right now that some communities have with cops and COVID-19, recipe for disaster, DJ.
Yeah. So challenging for them. Like I said, it's sort of double whammy of things that are going on at the same time, and one complicates the other. Are there lessons that kind of the cities that were hit earliest, New York particularly, are there lessons that they learned there, in regard to COVID and policing during this, that communities like Houston, places in Brazil now where epidemics are back on the rise, can apply? Have they shared information? How has that gone?
Sure. I think part of that, again, is, we talk about this from a leadership perspective, is lessons learned or best practices. And this was something that we did in the FBI quite well, which is if the New York City office did something well, whatever is related to crisis management, counterintelligence investigations, counter-terror investigations, they were required to share that information with other offices. Same thing when I served in Mexico City. Anything that we learned while we were there, we shared with our partners, and our partners, we hoped and we believed, did the same with us. We can't do this alone. So as we're learning in New York State, and I'll use a classic example, it's not law enforcement related per se, except for the fact that when a governor makes an edict, who is going to enforce it? If you say abolish the cops, but the governor says you can't have any mass gatherings of more than 10 people. You can't have anybody congregating in bars. You can't have tables open in restaurants that are less than 6 feet apart. Well, if a business owner is not complying with that, who enforces it? You don't send a social worker for that. The onus goes back on cops. And I'll use a perfect example in New York, and I think it's one thing that we learned a deadly lesson on, which was requiring nursing homes to take COVID-19 positive patients. Huge lesson learned there. Why? Because we learned that people that are old, infirm, feeble, or the very young are the most susceptible to it. So we learned that lesson pretty quickly. And obviously, every human death is a tragedy. You want to do what you can to prevent that. But now going forward, learning that information, sharing that with other cities of similar population densities or similar, layouts, because there's a lot of cities in Latin America that are laid out like New York City is, which means very dense, small island, Manhattan, but lots and lots and lots of people on it. So hopefully, DJ, and again, I hope I'm not speaking in hopes and prayers that these things are happening, but my belief is that that information is being shared just like it is on the law enforcement end. Look, let's suggest that this thing spikes like everyone, all the medical professionals anticipate it does. What if they come up with a vaccine, right? What if they come up with a cure and all of a sudden it's available in limited quantities? Who's going to make sure that that gets dispensed safely and gets to who it needs to get to without a riot? The cops. And that's another thing I think that I don't know if everybody is looking at from the perspective of, if we do have this anticipated spike and people start to get afraid again, like they were at the beginning, the onset of this back in January and early February, how do we handle the distribution of medical supplies that are going to keep people alive or potentially cure people once we find a cure?
Yeah, you talk about the lessons learned, and hopefully that is an ongoing process. Do you see any of the changes that from a safety perspective of law enforcement and first responders that will be permanent? I mean, has this permanently change the way that they're going to have to operate.
Yes, and I don't want to jump ahead because I know you've got topic number 3 coming up, which is going to be, collaboration and public-private partnerships and international relationships. But a lot of it is that I do not believe in our country anymore the police can do everything, and I do believe that they have in the 21st century, with the threats that we now face, that the founding fathers of this country could never have envisioned, back in the 18th century. We cannot do it alone. It's the old, in the global war on terrorism, what was the old saying? If you see something, say something. Well, that requires relationships. And we talked about at the top here, building relationships between cops and urban communities, or, communities of color. How can we better do that? And to your point here, whether it's related to COVID-19 or whether it's related to, going forward, how do we better the relationship so that police can focus on what they need to focus on, law enforcement can focus on what they need to focus on, and yet at the same time, still have a symbiotic, and that's the word here, symbiotic relationship, so that them being in touch with the folks that handle infrastructure in whatever country it is, or private businesses like hotels or sporting venues, schools, educational systems, communications networks and venues. We have to have those relationships. And there was an old saying when I first became an FBI agent, I was signed to an NYPD FBI task force, and a detective, an old crusty detective, said to me, "Hey, Jimmy, when you're standing over a chalk line," and that's how we describe a dead body, a homicide, that's not the time right then to meet all the other state, local, and federal investigators in the area. You do that first. You don't show up at a crime scene and hand out business cards and shake hands. And guess what? That applies at the national level, and that applies at the international level as well.
Yeah, that is a great segue into this next topic. We probably have 5 minutes or so left, so let's take a look at that. And it is interesting how all 3 of these issues do interrelate. There's no way that you can separate what's going on, in the environment, which we've talked about in the first 2 issues, and now how you address them. And collaboration is such a huge part of this, not only between law enforcement and private industry, which we've talked about in the past, and I'd like you to expound a little bit on, but also collaboration among different countries. And that's something that you're well versed in, having had experience primarily in Mexico, but I'd like to sort of kind of get an idea from your experience about how important that is. You've touched a little bit on it right there. How do we go about that? How do we go about creating these ties and doing the meeting and the introductions that you said you should be doing up front, but a lot of people don't, and a lot of agencies don't.
I think, DJ, a big part of that is just interpersonal relationship skills. And one of the things I learned as a cadet at West Point was communication, and how important it was. Just right now, we're not, the audience, I'm not going to see them. I'm not going to be able to interact with them and have that human interaction while I do this, right? But I also understand that there are 3 components that people, even though this is going to be translated into other language, that they're going to receive in the communication realm from me. One is body language, the second is tone, and the third are the actual words that you use. Body language is 55% of human communication. I believe 38% of it is tone, 7%, if my math works out there, that should be 100%, but 7% is the actual words. That has to be done by face-to-face meetings. And when I was in Mexico, I spoke Spanish, but I spoke poor Spanish. Now, the Mexicans there were very patient with me, and the senior government officials that spoke beautiful English and perfect Spanish, they would let me stumble through it because they knew it was an effort I was making at the time as a 48-year-old man to learn a second language, which it's easier to learn a language when you're 5. It's easier to learn 2 or 3 languages, young kids, because their minds are malleable. You get older, it gets much more difficult. And I'm not making myself out to be a martyr. What I'm suggesting it is that effort meant everything to them. So they would patiently wait for me to destroy their language, bastardize it, and make all kinds of mistakes, but they appreciated that fact. That went a long way. The second was appreciating them as partners. You know, Mexico and the United States and the United States and other countries and continents have had complicated relationships. I mean, we had, you know, we went to war with Mexico in 1846 and we took part of their country. And there's, you know, there are long-standing misgivings and things that, you know, yes, it's a different world now. Yes, those of us today are not guilty of the sins of our forefathers in any respect, but by the same token, understanding that, viewing people as partners. I viewed the host nation when I was in Mexico, or when I spent time in Brazil with Director Free back in, you know, 1997 and 1998. I viewed them as partners, and they knew their country, their culture, and the threats that were posed to them much better than I did. No matter how much of a student of history I could find, you know, figure I was, it helped me greatly to enter into those relationships with humility. And then the second piece of it is, it's a symbiotic relationship. Look, we talk about the border all the time, and borders are important, and I get it, you know, for security reasons. Now, look, some of the issues I had along the border, I mean, the United States shares a 2,000-mile border with Mexico. It shares a 5,000-mile border with Canada, right, in North America. The issues weren't with Mexico and the Mexicans, and it wasn't with Canada and the Canadians. It was bad state actors that were attempting to get people into the country, whether it's Mexico and then have them come up through the border, or Canada and ingress on the border from China, from Russia, from Iran, and even North Korea. And it's funny, and I only have one prop for this, by the way. So this book was a gift to me from my wife, called Masters of Deceit by J. Edgar Hoover, right? The first director of the FBI. It was written in 1958. DJ, he spoke about the threat of election meddling back in 1958. Now, there were no Russian disinformation troll farms back then. There was no cyber to conceive of. There was no, hey, we're going to use social media to whip up frenzy and foment dissension and discord. We're going to sow anarchy. That's not what he was thinking back then. He was worried about it from a different perspective, but he warned about it. And what happened in 2016? We had election meddling. And there's still people today that are not confident in the results, and they won't be confident in the results, whatever side of the political aisle they're on, in 2020. That is a concern, because in the West, in all the countries we've talked about, they're democracies, they're representative republics. And guess what? Elections and the fact that the results stand up and give those folks that are in the electorate confidence is important. And then real quickly, because I know we're coming up on time here, we got to worry about things like human trafficking. And I know that sounds crazy. I mean, slavery has been around since 8000 BC, and here we are, you know, 2,000 years on the other side of BC. So we're looking at 10,000 years, and it still exists in places like Eritrea and other places. But human trafficking exists in our country, where people are bought and sold in bondage, brought across, smuggled across the border, either through tunnels or, you know, as, you know, in the back of trucks or whatever. That's a real concern. Mexico cares about that. The United States cares about that. Countries in Latin America care about that. That's really important. And then lastly, terrorism. And I know the threat to other countries, because the United States is such an attractive target to terrorists, but terror attacks have happened across Europe. They've happened in Latin America for different reasons, whether it's left-wing extremism or right-wing extremism. They exist, and we have to take them seriously. People want to make political statements, and they want to use either violence or the threat or intimidation of violence to get political change or social change. And that's something that we have to be concerned about. I mean, across the globe, you know, there are far left groups, whether it's, you know, ISIS, the Taliban, Al-Shabaab, Boko Haram. Those are the four most lethal terrorist groups across the globe. But we even have a problem here in the United States with white supremacists. So the FBI director last year described the threat from white supremacy as persistent and pervasive, 2 P's, persistent and pervasive. We can't discount them. We have to get out in front of them, and we have to share information with our partners in Latin America. And that is so important, because just like the United States built a relationship with Mexico to combat narco traffickers, and look, you know, we successfully were able to prosecute and send away for the rest of his life Chapo Guzman. And that was a bilateral decision to work that together, because if Mexico didn't extradite him, if they didn't help us out with the evidence, he may not have been convicted. So that's just one example of how we work together in the international realm. But these are all things going forward that they've been around for a long time. They're not going to change. The means and mechanisms and methodologies may change, but they're still going to require us to work together and collaborate on this front in order to meet these new emergent threats.
All right. That's probably a great place to wrap this up. We could literally sit here all day long, I think, and go back and forth and discuss these issues. There's so much here, but I want to thank you, Jimmy. We're going to take questions from the audience. So if you have questions, you can type them into the chat. We'll read them out, and we will answer them, as we go. So type those into your webinar dashboard under the questions tab, and we will take care of them. All right, Jimmy, I'm going to give folks a second or two to look at this and ask their questions. We do have plenty that have come in. I am going to take just a second. I'm having a Wi-Fi issue, so I'm going to switch places. So when my camera comes back up, you're going to see a little bit of a different background. Jimmy will look the same. And we have plenty that have come in, Jimmy. So I'm going to start taking questions if you're ready. What do you think? You ready to answer some questions from our audience?
Ready to go. If you haven't heard my voice long enough now, hopefully I can answer any questions you got.
Fantastic. First one has to do with the idea of collaboration that we just talked about. It says, how do you see the trends regarding law enforcement impact private security, and how can we, meaning the private security industry, foster that collaboration?
Well, let's speak about it from two perspectives. Nationally speaking, we have public-private partnerships, right? Because the federal government, state, local law enforcement, they can't do everything. And I know this is just one small piece of it, but the FBI a number of years ago came up with this thing called the DSAC, the Domestic Security Alliance Council. And what it did was it was a quid pro quo system. So we asked folks that were in the hotel industry, the communications industry, the professional sports industry, the education industry. We invited senior leaders, CEOs, COOs, and chief security officers to come in for briefings. Now, the briefings gave them insight into what the emergent trends were. No, it wasn't classified information, but it was stuff that wasn't publicly available. And so in return for that, we asked them to be our eyes and ears on the outside, because police can't be everywhere. The security industry can't be everywhere. So nationally speaking, we use conglomerations like the DSAC to do that, to foster PPP, which has become the new buzzword right now, right? It's the acronym that says public-private partnerships. I mean, that's just the way going forward. Overseas, dealing internationally, whether it's with Mexico or Brazil or Italy or parts of Europe, other parts of Latin America, we use a thing called an MLAT, and that stands for Mutual Legal Assistance Treaty. And that was really, really important for me. The 2 years I spent in Mexico in 2013 and 2014, that was very important, which meant that the Attorney General's office in the host country and the Attorney General's office in the United States, the Department of Justice, were able to work together through these legal assistance treaties or mutual legal assistance treaties. I think those two things are going to become very important going forward, because when the economy dips down and we don't have a lot of extra money and there's austerity budgets and we've got to rely on collaboration, and as globalization occurs and we realize that terrorism isn't something that's somewhere else, it can reach out and touch us everywhere, and not just terrorism involving bullets and bombs, but cyber warfare, that collaboration, DJ, is essential.
Yeah, so many ways that the private security industry can get involved in this. It's great to sort of build those bridges as we move forward, and vital to do that too. So you talked about professionalizing the police force. We have a question that came in on that, and it asks, what role will education play in the context of professionalization? Mention was made about lengthening police training, but what about education? These are two separate items that need to be addressed. Do you see a role for formal education as well as sort of specific police training in the professionalization of police forces?
Yeah, that's a great question. So let me just give you some numbers. So the largest police department in the United States is the NYPD, the New York City Police Department. There are 35,000 police officers. On the federal side, there are only 12,000 FBI agents. So for every FBI agent that works around the globe, there are 3 New York City police officers. Now, what does that mean? Well, in the FBI, you're required to have a minimum of a 4-year degree before you can start training. For police officers, because there are some 700,000 to 800,000 uniformed officers across the country, we can't require 4-year degrees. There's just not that much of a talent base. And why is that? Well, people go to school and get a college education, and then they look at what the pay is, what the pay scale is for policing, and they go, I'm not interested in that. I can make more money somewhere else, Silicon Valley, Wall Street, some other place. So what we need to do is require a requisite level of education. And again, education isn't a panacea. It's not the end-all cure-all. There are smart people that never went to college, and there are dumb people that have advanced degrees. What we need to require is experience. So taking a 18-year-old or 19-year-old kid, giving him a badge and a gun and expecting him to have the requisite maturity and experience level of adults is not fair. And so, DJ, to the question that you just asked, I believe that training should be increased. Now, that costs money. So when you say, let's defund the police, let's push the money to social programs, but let's also then not give enough money to police academies to properly train our folks, that's the problem. So I think an extension of police academies, you can't do the quick microwavable, hey, we'll send you away for 6 weeks and now you're going to be a law enforcement officer that understands the Constitution, understands the Fourth Amendment, the First Amendment, the Second Amendment, citizens' rights, and the laws that you are supposed to uphold and enforce. There's got to be a sweet spot. And I know I've overused that term, but we got to find the sweet spot.
Right, right. So a question just came in, sort of in reaction to what we talked about as far as collaboration. It looks like collaboration between law enforcement agencies in different parts of the country and/or world. The question is, has any progress been made with regard to fusion centers? Intelligence is vast, however, getting it out quickly to multiple agencies has been an issue.
That's another great question. So we know that the first Joint Terrorism Task Force, the JTTF, was founded in 1980, believe it or not, with the FBI and the New York City Police Department. We have come leaps and bounds in the 40 years since. I mean, we've really come leaps and bounds from there. And an important part of that is also involving international partners. It doesn't do us any good to worry about, you know, terrorist organizations like Al-Qaeda or Boko Haram or Al-Shabaab, any of those places overseas. And those are left-wing groups, and there are also right-wing groups. But if we don't have relationships with Germany, where right-wing extremism is an issue, then that sets it back and makes it more difficult. So part of that becomes that sharing of information and intelligence. So the United States has relationships across the globe. Every other country has some certain relationships, whether it's through the United Nations or whether or not it's on the law enforcement end. That is so important. And unfortunately, when we have breakdowns diplomatically or politically, it impacts law enforcement, because cops in Brazil, cops in Italy, cops in Nairobi, Kenya, we all think alike. We just want to protect and serve. And when things get mixed up at the top between the political and the diplomatic levels, we need to make sure that law enforcement is given what they need, and that intelligence sharing during this age of globalization in the 21st century remains unfettered and unblocked. That's got to be a shared effort. Collaboration is the key, DJ.
Absolutely. So we talked about the pendulum quite a little bit and the sweet spot, and you mentioned that we've said that phrase quite often during this during our talk here today. The question is, what will shift public sentiment back in favor of law enforcement? Do you have an opinion on, you know, when and how that will happen? Because, you know, obviously, as you mentioned, the public starts to think one thing and then maybe overcorrects and thinks the other thing, and it just goes back and forth. But regarding the current situation, do you see a shift that will bring us back to a better place, you know, in the near future?
Yeah, there's an old Asian proverb, DJ, that says the left wing and the right wing are both part of the same bird. And when you think about that, that's it. It's moving people off the extreme fringes, right? So you look at it like a football field, right? So really, the majority of us are between the 20-yard lines. We're the reasonable folks between the 20-yard lines. We've got to try to find some consensus. I think stuff that's said on both sides can be hyperbolic and reckless and not designed to bring people together. Look, as a law enforcement officer, spent half my life in law enforcement, I have to acknowledge that there are issues and there are valid reforms that the industry must take on. And you mentioned it, professionalization. On the other side, the notion that we have to throw the baby out with the bathwater, or as the anarchists suggest, we have to burn the system down literally and figuratively, will not get us there. We got to get sober adults, and that's why I'm glad you guys are hosting this, sober adults in the same room to talk about this. There's got to be a give on both sides, because neither side has a monopoly on the truth.
All right, Jimmy. We could talk about this forever. We are past the hour, unfortunately. This has been a fantastic session. As I mentioned, we're simulcasting in Mexico and Brazil today, as well as the US. These issues go across the board, and I just want to thank you so much for coming and addressing it in the way you have, a really sober look at all of these issues. So I just wanted to mention before we left that our broadcast will be recorded, has been recorded, and will be available on ISC News as soon as we have it up there. We will let folks who registered for the webinar know via email that the recording is available. I want to thank the audience for hanging in through a full hour plus of this, and for some great questions. Jimmy, thank you again, and we will see you all next time.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, DJ.